Okay, we've started this weekend by looking at the possible implications of Ireland adopting, or options, if you like, were Ireland to have adopted the mixed member proportional system. We're now going to have a debate on the question, is there anything wrong with the single transferable vote system? The system that has been in place since the foundation of the state, the system that people know, in some cases know and love, in other cases know and are critical of. And to debate this question, we have, I would say, two significant practitioners with very considerable experience, if you like, of the art of politics. Brendan Halligan was the General Secretary of the Labour Party for many years. He was elected to the Dáil in 1976. He has a wide range of engagements with politics over the years, and he was the founder and is still the chairman of the Institute of International and European Affairs, which has made such a contribution to public and political discourse in this country. Noel Whelan is a well-known current political commentator, but he has a long-term background in political engagement and is a barrister in his own right, and has been, associated with if you like, proposals for political reform for many years, but is still a very significant proponent of the current electoral system. So we're going to hear both sides of this argument. Brendan, as somebody who believes the current system should be changed, and Noel, who believes we should retain it. Each of them will have 10 minutes, so I ask Brendan to take the floor.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to address the convention, and secondly, I want to say that it is a great honour, and particularly on such a beautiful morning. Now, the question is a very simple one. It says, is there anything wrong with the single transferable vote? Putting another way, is it fit for purpose? I think that an electoral system should perform at least three functions. First of all, it should provide a fair result. Secondly, a functioning parliament. And thirdly, effective government. Now, for a fair result, it has to provide a broad proportionality between the votes cast for parties and the seats they gain in the parliament. And I think that confers legitimacy on the parliament, and it also gives a sense of equity to society, and both of these are essential for democracy. Now, as it happens, STV can produce proportionality, broadly speaking, and it does so at the moment, not least because of the Constituency Commission. And I don't intend to deal with that point any further. Now, secondly, it must provide the parliamentarians who can make Parliament work effectively. And what does that mean? Well, I think it means that Parliament has to frame the law, it has to develop policy, it has to oversee the government and hold it accountable, and it has to represent the people and respond to them. I think these are very fundamental and basic to a functioning democracy. And thirdly, the electoral system, the third function, should produce a stream of parliamentarians who in turn can produce good ministers, which that leads on to good government. And after all, good government is what society wants. So let's look at the second criterion, this one about the producing a functioning and effective parliament. Now, I think the key argument here is a very simple one, and it is that parliaments have to break down their workload, which is enormous, and they divide it into committees. And this happens all over the world, and it therefore leads to a distinction in the work of the parliamentarian between the work in the plenary session, where the Parliament as a whole meets, and in the committee rooms, where parliamentarians specialising in a particular subject meet. Now, good committee work is very different to the work in the plenary. It demands a lot of time, much of it unseen. It demands, excuse me, expertise in a particular policy area. Could be taxation, could be energy, could be social affairs. It demands skill in handling paper, sometimes a large amount of paper, interpreting research, assessing evidence, receiving representations from citizens and experts, and most particularly holding government ministers and senior civil servants to account. That's where you come face to face with government ministers and, more importantly, in many regards, with senior civil servants. So to sum that up, I'd say the committees should be able to both generate policy, that is an active role for the parliamentarian, and also to examine policy, it's a more reactive role where government comes to them. Now, I think committees really can only work because they're a particular form of organisation if they have the right sort of parliamentarian to man them. The basic requirements seem to be very simple, and the first is time, and the second is expertise, and the third is the skills I've mentioned. But also it requires a mentality that puts the national interests above local interests. And I think at the moment there's a widespread consensus that the single transferable vote produces a different type of parliamentarian. It produces parliamentarians who, by and large, these are general propositions, not universal statements, by and large, who put constituency interests above national interests, and who don't have the time, which is an important factor, actually to devote themselves properly to committee work. Why? Because they're doing something else, which is that they're looking after constituents. And for example, the constituency clinic is something of which we are all familiar with and which is time absorbing. I think the general consensus would be that the parliamentarians this system produces don't have the expertise, the qualifications to actually man the committees, or don't have the time to develop the qualifications and expertise. And this was well, I think, expressed by Dan O'Brien of the Irish Times in a very interesting article last summer in what he called the choice architecture, because he was reflecting on why is it that in his experience Irish parliamentarians seem to be of a lesser quality than those with whom he had been coming in contact the previous 25 years throughout the rest of Europe. And he came up, as an economist would, with an economic answer, and he called it choice architecture, which comes from behavioural economics. And that is to say that when the elector goes in to the ballot booth and is presented with a ballot paper, that the choice is skewed for the elector in a particular direction towards those who solve local problems in the immediate term rather than solve national problems in the longer term. So the system is skewed towards short-termism and localism as distinct from long-term and national. And I think that his analysis was a particularly good one. So I think that the inevitable result of this choice architecture is that our committees don't work effectively. There's general consensus on that. In fact, when I went into Leinster House, there was no committee system whatsoever in the 1970s. Interestingly, as a consequence, there weren't even committee rooms. When committees were eventually established in the middle 70s, the first thing was actually to look for committee rooms. Now, some people can say, look, this doesn't really matter whether these committees work or not. The Parliament will work anyway. In that case, then, there's no more to be said. Some may even go further and say, actually, it doesn't matter whether Parliament works or not. It's really all down to government, in which case, then there is no more to be said. But if you think that it does matter, then I think it puts the focus on the electoral system very clearly, because that electoral system is concentrated on personalities rather than policies, and it's concentrated on the local at the expense of the national. Now, the third criterion we've talked about is effective government. And I think here the system has got to produce a stream of high-quality parliamentarians who in turn then become high-quality ministers. And the reasoning for that is very simple. We've adopted the Westminster model. We didn't question that model in 1922. We incorporated it automatically into the Constitution. This man over here was greatly responsible for that. We had no other model in our heads, anyway, from the first Dáil. So in effect, what happens is that the people elect the parliamentarians elect the Taoiseach. It's their second job on the first meeting of a new Dáil. The Taoiseach then chooses the ministers from the parliamentarians who have elected him or her. So there is a direct link between the parliamentarians and who are elected for local purposes mainly, and the government ministers who are elected with national responsibility. Now, it's sometimes, I think, an accident that this system produces good ministers at all. So the electoral system has a profound influence on the quality of government in terms of its personnel. I think the question for debate and the question to be answered, therefore, is, are we getting, or do we normally get, good quality government? Now, if the answer is yes, we do, then there's no more to be said about the electoral system. Fine. But if the answer is, well, not all the time, or a most emphatic no, well, then I think the single transferable vote as a system needs to be critically examined. Now, interestingly, this man over here, I hadn't seen this photograph before. You know, when STV was, proportional representation was incorporated into the Free State Constitution, it was done so without any great examination. The Constitution prescribed proportional representation broadly, in broad terms, as the system of election to be employed. But neither the Dáil Éireann nor anybody else really looked into it very deeply. The reason for that is a long one, not for today, but mainly because Arthur Griffith was committed to introducing PR into the Constitution to protect the Southern Unionists, and he believed that STV and PR were the one and the same thing, which they are not. And there was very little debate on it either when Bunreacht na hÉireann, which we were discussing, was debated in Dáil Éireann in 1937. And it goes further, of course. It says not only PR, but it actually prescribes STV as the form of PR to be used. And there was very little debate on two referenda which did take place on abolishing it or retaining it. And I was involved in one of them, and I can assure you that the debate was very, very rudimentary and very fundamental. Now, the concluding point I'd make is that of the European Union at the moment, 20 of the member states use a different form of system, electoral system. In fact, they use the list system, and 3 others use a combination of list and proportionality, such as Germany. Prima facie, there's something to be said about examining a system that's not used by anybody else except that great, mighty political and economic power, Malta. Well, I think that, and which has, of course, a history very similar to ourselves. So I want to thank and congratulate the Convention for putting this issue on the agenda and for examining it. And in summing up, I'm simply saying that the electoral system should perform 3 functions, as I mentioned: proportionality, functioning parliament, effective government. It meets proportionality, fine. That's mechanical, and it's a direct mathematical relationship that can be constructed, and it works. The second one is organisational. Does it help to organise the Parliament in the way in which it would most effectively discharge its national responsibilities? The way in which you do that is through committees. That's a universal response everywhere. Does the system then produce the right parliamentarians to man the committees? Here I go back to Dan O'Brien's choice architecture. And lastly, then, we have the question of dealing with the right form of government. Does it produce governments that can effectively manage the economy, deal with social issues like childcare, old age care, global issues like global warming, European affairs like the euro crisis? And I think that for so long as we use the Westminster model, then the electoral system is key to good government. And I don't think we're going to change the Westminster model. So hence, it is absolutely key. Now, I'll finish by saying that, look, electoral systems are complex. There's no simple solution, and I'm not providing one. But there is general agreement on the fact that they have a powerful influence on the political system as a whole, the sort of parliament we get, the sort of government we get. And I think that nothing could be more important than looking at it in all of its aspects. The question is there something wrong with STV? You have been charged with the responsibility of making that choice, making that decision for yourselves, and I just hope I have helped you in some way in arriving at the right conclusion. Thank you.
I appear for the accused, the PRS-TV system. It's accused of causing weaknesses and defects in our system that are the crimes of other aspects of our political system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the invitation to speak to the Constitutional Convention. I followed its establishment with some cynicism. I've watched its deliberations with some fascination and regard and particular interest, as you discussed last week, the electoral system. Our politics is broken. Our politics is dysfunctional. Our Dáil, and I'm only going to talk about the Dáil today, I promise, our Dáil has the weaknesses which Brendan identified, but he has the wrong part of the system in the dock. Because it's the most prominent part of the system, because he or she, if you take the system that way, is the person around when the crime happens, doesn't mean that it is the cause of it. The electoral system was debated little in the constitutional formation process. Brendan is correct, largely because there was a general consensus around it. There was a general consensus around it. It had been in practice in the local election systems in particular, and had been adopted in the local elections and other systems for the purpose of ensuring representation for minority interests in particular. I'm always wary of political scientists or politicians bearing the gift of alternative electoral systems as the cure-all for perceived defects in the current systems. I get even more suspicious when it's economists who are offering that argument. And I'm always wary of this word, quality parliamentarians. The ultimate arbitration of what amounts to a quality parliamentarian is thankfully one which in a democracy, for all its defects, leaves ultimately to the people to decide. In addition to, I suppose, work as a political analyst or a hobby as a political analyst and writer in politics for the last 20 years, I did work for 8 years in Fianna Fáil headquarters. And then in 1997 I thought until this morning I was rejected by the voters of Dublin South East. I'm now glad to know that I was the least favoured, or the 10th least favoured of 12 of the voters in Dublin South East. I'll go home with a spring in my step, but it was their decision. There's every possibility, had there been a mixed member system, that such standing was I in then with the Ahern regime. I fell out with them afterwards. I'd probably been on the list and in Leinster House, and my life might have taken a different course. But that brings me to a point that you're not being asked here whether PRS TV is good or bad. You've now moved to a second stage of deliberations, which is to consider in more detail the mixed member list system and whether it would be better. And here I turn to a point flagged by Charlie Flanagan and David and others, which is it's not so much that the alternative, the list system, would give the parties more power or would transfer power to the parties. It's how it would distribute power within the parties that is the greatest weakness of the alternative being proposed. I suspect that in Charlie's Haughey's time, if we take a historical example, George Colley would have been on the Fianna Fáil list, but probably at a number 167. The party leader will, of course, set up a McSharry committee or some formalised process by which the order of the list would be picked, some veneer of internal party democracy, but ultimately he or she would exercise all of the political influence to get the result they want in terms of who is ordered on the list. And that matters not only because it shapes who gets elected from the party, but how they behave once elected by the party. Very few politicians worry about how they got elected the last time. They worry about how they're going to get elected the next time. And whether you're Peter Matthews, agree with him or don't agree with him or not, or Lucinda Creighton on more prominent issues, agree with her or not, the power of the party leader to decide not only whether you hold office and all that patronage or privilege, whether you progress within your party, but actually whether you're on the list and where you're on the list in the next election would be a significant additional patronage, power and control, which would be giving party leaderships over their parliamentary party members in a list system. Now listen, I was involved in it myself. Party leaderships and headquarters can seek to massage, even in the current system, how candidates, what candidate comes out of convention. But there's no guarantees on it. And I've sat in Mount Street many nights when word came back from conventions that they had picked what we regarded as the electoral dud, or the contrarian within the party, who the electorate then decided, although he was the third, or he or she was the third party candidate selected in the multi-seat constituency, that that's the one they got to choose and they wanted. Or our current system allows, where not selected by the party by reason of opposition from headquarters or leadership or otherwise, they can get elected as an independent. The ultimate decision on that, ladies and gentlemen, is left to the electorate itself. It's not only the power balance shift that would happen towards the parties, but it's the power balance within the parties. There is a move, thankfully there is a move, not least in Fianna Fáil because they got badly damaged on the last occasion. There is a move for one member, one vote conventions to have real power in the selection of political parties. To change the system to the list system would reverse that trend towards giving a headquarters, whatever its shape or form, and headquarters ultimately is the implementator of the wishes of the party leadership. The second thing I think it's need to be important of that, there is always a view in academic, although I have to say in fairness to the academics you're fortunate enough to have in this weekend and last weekend, they've been fairly blunt and straight about the complications that go with any switch to an alternative system. But there's always this view that if you change the architecture, the choice architecture is a new phrase for it, but if you change the constitutional architecture, you somehow solve the problems. That is not the situation. The Irish like to talk to somebody they know, whether it's going to get advice on buying a car or dealing with some other problem that arises in them. I resist the contention that localism or clientelism or constituency service is of itself a bad thing. It does, as has been indicated, keep the politicians grounded in the realities of everyday life. It covers breaches in the massive defects in our public service delivery system. They should be cured, but the reality is there will always be defects. The problem in our system isn't the constituency service and localism, it's the extent of it. It needs to be contained. It's the intensity of it that is part of the problem. And I'm not convinced that would change if the system switched to multi-member. Let me illustrate by example. There's a working presumption, perhaps, that you would break the TDs, and if we take Michael Gallagher's example, you'd have 79 TDs who were constituency TDs, and you'd have 79 TDs who were national TDs. In reality, in the Irish system, you would not. Because the national TDs, or the TDs elected off the national list, would still be shadowing a particular geographic constituency, because that's their only way of ensuring that they themselves have some prospect of getting elected the next time if their party's national vote falls. Charlie Flanagan, I'll pick on him because he identified himself earlier, would probably have lost out to Sean Fleming in a single seat constituency under multiple list system in 2007. He'd have hockeyed Sean Fleming for the same seat in 2011. But for the time in between, Charlie Flanagan, even if elected on the national list, depending on how high up it he was, whether he was or was not in favour with Enda Kenny at the time, would have spent the 5 years in between shadowing Laois, working Laois and servicing Laois as the best way of making sure that he had his own independent power base from the geographic constituency if the party's vote shaped otherwise. The other illustration, and again just because she's in my eye line, is Maureen O'Sullivan. The problem under the list system is that unless the independence power base is concentrated in a tight geographic area, there are very great difficulties in emerging at all within the alternative system, ladies and gentlemen. Our politicians should be better at committee work, and would be better at committee work if they felt it had any real impact. It does have real impact, but the problem is they engage so much in localised political activity because it's more rewarding, because they can have an impact on individual lives, on individual community projects, on individual industrial developments, whereas they find themselves banging their heads and almost being vote fodder on the big national questions because of the centralisation of power within the cabinet, within our Dáil, and the hold which the cabinet has on our system. Of course, lawyers are always conservative, constitutional lawyers in particular, are always conservative about the notions of tinkering with the Constitution. And if you're persuaded that the alternative is better, then please follow your instincts in that regard. But my contention is that the cure being advanced is for a disease not caused by PRS-TV, and the cure being advanced has side effects that would only make the complications and distresses and the body politic worse.
Thank you very much, Noel. I mean, I think we've had two very effective contributions there, and we have about 20 minutes for questions and comments. Joanna, please.
Thanks, Chair. Brendan Halligan, he doesn't think that the citizens here can be trusted to pick the right parliamentarians. And I was just wondering who instead does he think should make the decision, and why are they wiser than the citizens in terms of picking the representatives?
Okay, thank you. Did I see? So Angus. Yeah.
Angus O'Snuddick. Just an interesting aspect. A lot of people have concentrated on the power that, say, Enda Kenny or Jerry Adams or whoever the party leader is in determining the list and the pace people hold in the list. You could introduce legislation to ensure that the lists are forwarded by head office and then are randomly placed in an order and then produced by an electoral commission so that the party puts forward. And that means that the cronyism or the power that the party leader would have could be dissipated slightly.
Thank you. Maureen? I'm going to, as we proceed during the day, attempt to make sure that we have a diversity of voices here. So, Maureen, then John.
Catherine Murphy.
Catherine, sorry.
It's okay. We're both independents. That's what's
I
confused you. No, just it might be useful. I mean, one of the theses that's been put forward is that this list system, or a list system, or a variety of things, might bring greater expertise into the Oireachtas or into the Dáil. You would be drawing it from the parties, and if you look at the way people are practicing politics at the moment, a lot of people who would have formerly joined political parties are now involved in different type of political activity. And in fact, there's a very small number of people, as a proportion of the population, who are in the political parties. Can you tell us where that additional expertise is going to be found within those political parties in that kind of an environment? Because I think it does matter that there is actually going to be a choice to be made. I suspect that political parties will try and select the people who they feel are the best people within their organisations in the main. So where is this expertise is what I'm asking.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Catherine. John Cran.
Thank you. I must say I'd like to thank the panel for their contributions, and I think the two contributions we've just heard were, I think, extremely excellent analyses of the alternatives that are being put forward. But I must say I think it's been hinted at by Brendan Halligan that none of these reforms today would deal with the fundamental problem of how we pick ministers, and I think we're kind of skirting around the issue. We're still going to be left with a group of people from whom we pick our ministers, a gene pool, whose principal skill is negotiating a local party organisation or a national party organisation. That's who you're going to be left with. And I always use the analogy, not the analogy, but the example, when President Obama was elected, realising that one of the key existential issues facing not only his country but our species in this century will be energy policy. He's able to pick a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and energy expert as the Secretary for Energy. Now, I'm not making any comments about any of the folks who have been incumbents in that particular position here, but clearly we're very limited in who we can actually pick. On a somewhat more practical and technical issue, the issue which I think Noel is correctly pointing out, that there is a tendency in list systems, and I must say I'm attracted to some variant of it, not as much for the list aspect, but for the aspect of getting away from the parochialism. One of the possible mechanisms, it just strikes me, that we could perhaps apply if there were some variant of a system like that, and I know it sounds cumbersome, is the notion of the primary election, that the actual people have some role in deciding who will be on the list, either by registering themselves as supporting one or other party in advance of the election, or perhaps by having a more open access policy of party membership. The third one I would say is, what's wrong with the idea of actually trying to take the influence of parties out of the system altogether and opening the nomination process to broad popular mandates that people must collect large numbers of individual nominations from 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 or 50,000, I don't know what the number is, of their fellow citizens to be put on the ballot paper and try and disenfranchise the parties completely. Thank you.
Thanks, John. A couple of those issues you mentioned we'll be coming back to in the afternoon under another agenda item. Could I go to Noel first as a comment, and then after that we move over. But Noel, and we get a response here now first. Noel, and then Brendan.
There are a number of questions there. I'm sorry if I missed some of them, but can I take Angus's, Deputy Snuddick's point about the possibility of randomising the list once it gets in? That's an innovation that would solve the whole the leader or party headquarters might have on the ordering of the list. But I don't know if in terms of the electorate it's a very democratic thing to do, because that would mean that if they vote for Sinn Féin because they like Gerry Adams, they end up electing some Sinn Féin apparatchik whose number, in the ordinary course, is number 80 on the list in circumstances where they might only hope to win, say, 15 or 20 seats. And I think that's people will vote on the basis of who the front bench is, who the leadership is, what the quality of the party as they see it in the Parliament. And they're the people who they're going to see on television and assess in Parliament as, if they're incumbents. Whereas what they end up with then is a collection of politicians they don't know. I think that's a difference. I take Senator Crown's point about the need for expertise at the Cabinet or around or near the Cabinet table to some extent. But I think the skills required to be an effective minister are not purely policy expertise. We've had we'd have one incident. We've had barristers who were ministers for justice, some of whom were good and some of whom were bad, and solicitors the same. We've had one former Garda who was a minister for justice, and I don't think I'm maligning anybody by saying that it wasn't a good experience for the country. We have a minister for health now who's a medical expert, at least to the general practitioner level, and you'll appreciate the distinction I'm making there. Part of his weakness, I think, is that he doesn't have the political experience necessary or skills necessary to chart some of the political hurdles that are necessary to implement the kind of reform he wants to do in the area of health. The Energy Secretary, yes, in the US system is a policy expert or an expert in the area, but is only one of the many power centres around energy policy. The chairman of whatever the Energy Committee is in Congress is as, if not more powerful than the Energy Secretary, and he or she comes with obvious political skills. The solution may be in part to have some particular expertise by two or three ministers appointed directly or otherwise. On the question of directly nominating candidates, that can be done tomorrow. I think the figure is now 20, Michael. If you get 20 signatures, you or anyone in the room can run in any constituency. But the reality is, unless you have an issue or an experience or attraction or a background, it's very hard to get elected as independents. And that's why the systems inevitably find candidates grouping in the form of parties or organisations or something. As of now, you can tomorrow stand as an independent in the multi-seat PRSTV systems. It's a very difficult climb, as Catherine beside you will tell you.
Thanks, Noel. Brendan?
Chairman, first of all, just let me go back to the first point, which is that the constitutional structure that we created in 1922 was not widely debated at the time. And the use of STV had been used only on one occasion previously, and that was in 1920 in the Sligo Corporation by-election, as is well known. And there were very stringent critics of the whole system at the time, not least Meredith and John Cummins, both of whom I've written about before and, of course, were very little listened to. We adopted, the second point is we adopted the Westminster model truly without any real discussion. And that means that your executive and your legislature are intimately bound one with the other. In fact, Bunreacht na hÉireann says that the government is responsible to the Dáil, not to the Seanad, but to the Dáil. And of course, if it loses a vote in Dáil Éireann, must invariably seek a vote of confidence, and if it loses that, as a general election. So they're joined at the hip. We never really looked at alternative systems, a presidential or quasi-presidential system. And to claim otherwise, I think, is misrepresenting our history, which is a very particular one. I just want to make one point, as gently as I may, to Noel. I think that the experience of Fianna Fáil under Charles Haughey is so extreme that it cannot be used, in my view, as a general basis for arguing about anything. Now, regards distribution of power, I was a General Secretary. I tried to use the power to ensure who were the party officers, who were going to be candidates. Of course I did all that. I was also a candidate and went before selection conferences. And in one case, when we were choosing substitute MEPs for Dublin, I went before the whole Dublin party membership and opposed my party leadership at the time and was elected to be the candidate and the substitute. So in a sense, Joanna's question, John Tuffy's question is the key one. Who chooses the candidates? And I think it would be very helpful if we actually looked at how things happen on the ground rather than how we think they happen. In reality, candidates who go on the ballot list on the ballot table for a party are chosen by delegates or to a selection conference or by all the members in that constituency coming together, as now happens in the Labour Party. That's who chooses the candidates. Of course, the leadership can try and control, but very frequently there's a limit on what can be done locally. I've done it and tried it and failed. Lastly, just want to say that the very important question was brought up as to how do you get involved people into politics, and that's a different issue altogether, for which I don't have an answer. John Crown, finally, I should say, raised a very important question which I think is critical to the list system. He raised a question of the role of parties, the efficacies of parties. That's a very long question, a very deep question. I would simply posit this. I do not believe that parliamentary democracy would work without parties, which are themselves highly organised internally for debate. I just offer you the most successful democracy in Europe at the moment, politically and economically. You will find either in the Germanic-speaking peoples of Germany and Austria or in Scandinavia. And in both systems, the party is utterly and absolutely fundamental, and they both will use a form of list system.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to two, firstly Yvonne and then Francis, and then Hattie, do you want to? Yeah. And Robert, sorry, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Yvonne Carney, and I would like to say the list I don't think is ever going to work in this country for the simple reason there's only 18 women sitting in the Dáil, and they're not going to put those forward. The other thing I'd like to say is all these promises that were made to people before the election, not one of them has carried through. They've gone the opposite to everything. And they should sign a contract with all their promises and get thrown out if they don't carry them through. I mean, it's just ridiculous. They get people to vote for them and then they renege on it. When Charlie was mentioned, now we all knew what Charlie was like, but he looked after people, young, old, unemployed, whatever. And what Mr. Noel Whelan and Brendan Halligan has just said, I agree with both of them, although they're opposite ends of it. I do. They both have a lot. It's people like them that should be in the government, that say what they have to say.
Yeah, either by the list or the constituency basis, Yvonne. Okay, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to follow the line of the order that I saw people. Francis is next, and after that, Robert.
In deference to Noel and Brendan, I'll make a few comments. Brendan, I wanted to ask you really, what assumptions are you making about expertise? I mean, if you look at the recent crisis and you look at the expertise that's around in banking, in regulation and economics, are you saying if those individuals had been in government, maybe, governments would have done a better job, for example? And the point I want to make is this, that I think the whole question of expertise, I think very often you have quite elitist and possibly incorrect assumptions underlying it in terms of experts being involved in politics. But the point I'd want to make is that the access to expertise is critical. And I think equally the issue about, for example, the reform of the civil service and our public service in relation to expertise and expertise in departments is probably as critical an issue as some of the points that you're making about the list system. And also I think how the Dáil has access to expertise. And we've had some hearings recently where we've seen expertise being brought in and in the limelight, if you like, and how government then reacts to that. I think that's really, they're all critical aspects of the availability of expertise as well, I believe. And I think the other response to what you're saying is, how do you open up politics so that you get, a greater range of, professional groups interested in it? I mean, we have the system of coming up through local government in this country. I mean, that may be the issue more than, and who chooses to run for politics and how attractive or not attractive politics is to people, and the adversarial nature of our politics. For example, an awful lot of women particularly don't find the way we actually do our business that attractive. So I think those issues all come in to this issue of expertise and diversity and having a variety of people involved in politics. And Noel, I don't want to overindulge you, but you did say that you think the current system should say as it is, but there are other areas that need to be addressed within it. And I wanted to ask you if you could just highlight those areas that you feel, within the current system could be addressed.
As ever, we're really going to run out of time, and so there's a number of people that I've seen and that I'm going to ask to speak. There are some people, I'm afraid, that I'm not going to get to ask. But I mean, the list is, Robert is first. Where's Robert? Robert, yeah.
Thanks, Robert Dowds. 2 points and 1 question. First point that hasn't been touched on, one of the weaknesses in our present system is that there can be huge rivalry between 2 TDs of the same party, and that actually can take up a huge amount of a TD's time, which perhaps would be better used elsewhere. Second point, in relation to the committees, I mean, it really is important that they be greatly strengthened so that the committees can question ministers in a way that they probably can't do nowadays, and also question people who have been involved in things, for example, such as the banking crisis. And the third thing is a question. What effect do the experts think would be the case if ministers, when they were appointed, had to give up their Dáil seats and simply served as ministers, as happens in some cases?
Okay, thank you.
And how would that relate to the Parliament?
Okay, thank you. That's a very legitimate question. We will finish up at that table, Tom and then Pat, and then we're moving away from that table to a couple down there. Okay.
Thanks, Chairman. If I understood Brendan Halligan correctly, he said the Haughey extremism was not really a valid example. I would have to disagree. I think the old saying, if you don't learn from history, you will repeat it. Thank you.
Okay. Pat Hunt.
Thanks, Chairman. Very, very briefly, just a comment. It's in relation to the access to expertise by various governments. And the situation is, we can look at the French example, where in the previous government led by Nicolas Sarkozy, we had Christine Lagarde as a member of the cabinet, who is now currently chairperson of the IMF. And it still didn't stop France falling victim to a global economic crisis. I don't think it's a case that if we guarantee having a sufficient expertise in government that we protect ourselves from a calamity. It's just not happen. It doesn't happen. It may be a case we're better prepared to deal with it, but it doesn't necessarily safeguard us from a particular calamity in question. To answer Francis's point, or to take Francis up on a point, it's a case of politics is not an attractive game. It's a dirty business. Everybody here will admit that. It's involved in making unpopular decisions in difficult times and ultimately living with consequences. And that is the reason why people are not engaged in going into politics. They may do it for a noble reason, but the big deterrent is exactly that. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take Alban and then Joanna, and then we're closing it. Alban, please.
Thanks very much, Chairperson. Two very powerful submissions to the convention. But I just want to make one general observation. It seems to me that localism is a universal phenomenon in politics. I mean, the famous remark of Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. And I think we should remind ourselves of that. So we're not dealing with something that is particularly unique or special to Ireland. So I just want to make that point. The other point is this. I feel that there is a synthesis between what Brendan is saying and what Noel is saying. And that, I think, really works out in Dáil reform rather than electoral reform. Because what we're talking about is things like appointing ministers from outside Parliament and so forth. And I think strengthening the committee system, vitally important. And I think in the Northern Assembly, we have a good committee system that would actually act as a very good model for remodelling the Dáil in relation to committees. But finally, and this may be outside the terms of this particular debate today, given your directions this morning, but at the last session, we did have a report in relation to the simulated results of a mixed system, which I think Noel was partly responsible for. But my understanding of that was that there wouldn't be that significant changes between the current system of STV and the mixed system. So why would you create a radical change to get what would be essentially a marginal change? Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Alban and Joanna, and then we're going to move back to Brendan and Noel.
I'm sorry for coming in a second time, but I have to correct Brendan Halligan's version of history about PRS-TV. At the beginning of our independence, when we moved in, when we became an independent country, there was a huge civic movement to bring in PRS-TV as the most democratic electoral system. It was a worldwide, it's been a worldwide campaign, and it still lasts to this day. But the thing about it is that in Britain, Gladstone, as far as I recall, it was Gladstone, but it was the British Prime Minister blocked PRS-TV being brought in, and Ireland wanted to move away from the undemocratic nature of elections it had experienced through the British system, and it adopted PRS-TV. And PRS-TV operated to bring in minorities that wouldn't have otherwise been elected in Ireland, and it was the progressive and the fair thing to do, and it still is.
Okay, thank you. Well, Brendan, maybe you'd like to comment not just on that, but on any of the issues that raised from the floor that you feel you want to respond to.
Sure. I think that Francis Fitzgerald raised a very important question about this interrelationship between parliamentarians and expertise. I'm not, in fact, arguing for experts becoming parliamentarians. I'm arguing for exactly the opposite, for the parliamentarians becoming experts. Because I totally agree with Noel that it is a different profession. And the example that John Crown used of Stephen Shue being brought in by Obama, a Nobel winner, is a graphic example. Without disrespect to the man whom I knew slightly, he was not a success, and he was not reappointed. So it does require an extraordinary combination of qualities that is not widely understood outside of the profession. So I am not arguing for bringing in 166 experts. Right? I'm arguing for 166 parliamentarians becoming experts in something. And sometimes it's a general expertise is required. With regards to how do you open up politics, which reflected an earlier question, and I said I didn't have an answer. I'm now going to do something that parliamentarians or politicians should do frequently, and that is contradict themselves and admit to being wrong in public. And I'd say, actually, I do have an answer, but I thought it was outside the remit of the discussion, but now I understand it might not be. And the route is through local politics. And the route is to have a system of local government that will be very close to the French. That is, where practically every village or part of a parish has its own council and its own mayor. If we were to have the same number of mayors in Ireland as they have in France, proportionately, we would have 3,500 mayors. And I think that would be an enormous benefit for Irish politics and for Irish society. And it's the route in for people at the local level, and particularly for women. Now, I take your point entirely that it is a business that is not suited to the female psychology. And I remember that the chairman of the party under whom I served most of my time was the son of James Connolly, Roddy Connolly. And he was in favour of changing the system, that it was a male-dominated culture and worked very much against women. As regards the Robert's point about inter-party rivalry, it's an issue that should be brought up, and it requires a lot of discussion. Alban's made the point about localism being phenomenal. Tip O'Neill wrote famously said all politics is local, which it is, but he had the capacity to make it national and international at the same time. With regards to Joanna, her point, perhaps I'm not expressing myself properly. I am not against PR. I'm strongly in favour of PR, and of course it was progressive, and it was adopted at the end of the 19th century by practically every emerging democracy. I am simply against, on the basis of experience, the form of PR that we have used, STV. That's what I'm against.
Thanks. Brendan and Noel, now you do have the last word.
Okay, a couple of things. I can't answer the question without first thanking Yvonne for her kind comments. I now feel a little less favoured, and I'd be happy to give her the charge of a candidate list system if one was introduced, on the basis that myself and Brendan would then be top of it. Secondly, on the wider question, Brendan said I used, of course I did, the extreme example of Charles Haughey to illustrate the point about the control a party leader might have over the list. But political systems have to be designed in a way that withstands the extremes. They have to be designed in a way that allows for things to go wrong. And it's scaringly nearly a quarter of a century since I attend lectures by the other Professor Farrell, who always made the point that we have to start by giving our system some credit, notwithstanding the fact that our system was born in a civil war and for 30 or 40 of the years had to operate with effectively a civil war going on 40, 50 miles south of the capital in Northern Ireland. It withstood an awful lot of the stresses. We could not have imagined at that time the level of the economic distresses it would face as it has in recent times, but the system actually has withstood them. The system may have contributed to them, but it's important to note it had withstood them. The Irish rioted in the ballot box. There was a change of power, and that was all affected through the PR STV system. Francis Fitzgerald asked for how you would solve the problems in the parliamentary system that both Brendan and I see, and I agree with him entirely. We need to make our politicians experts, and rather than necessarily turning our experts into politicians. There are a couple of, you tackle that on both ways. On the localism and clientelist side, you make it unnecessary for TDs to get involved in representations by improving public sector delivery, by improving transparency, and there are fantastic possibilities there because of the advance of technology and internet. You make it unnecessary. In some instances, I would argue you make it illegal. We already do that. The TD can't write to the DPP, he can't write to NAM about a particular case, and I think he or she can't write to the revenue about a particular case. I'm not saying you would make all representation illegal, but there are certainly a number of categories where you could make it illegal, and the TDs might be relieved that they don't have to get involved in those areas. And then on the other side, and it's to some extent outside the remit of this committee, which is why I agree with, I think it was Francis's point earlier, that actually what this country needs is a citizens' assembly on the political system, not just on the constitutional dimensions thereof. And that's something you might consider in your recommendations at the end of your deliberations later this year. You found already with the Electoral Commission, which is not a constitutional issue, that it's actually systems designed below the constitutional stage that matter. And there, committee systems, the way in which committee chairs are elected, the services and support and expertise available as backup to TDs. I have some confidence, and disagree with Brandon to this extent, I have some confidence that the deputies now are more disposed towards playing an expert role on committees and specialising in certain areas, in part because the general level of their education, like that of the population, has risen dramatically. And there's a very interesting crop of young and not so young newer politicians who I think are making a significant impact day in, day out in the Dáil and in other house.
Thank you both very much. I want to just check, David or the two Michaels, do you want to add anything from what you heard? No?
Just,
Michael?
Just two points I thought that came up.
Microphone, Michael.
Almost every country in the European Union operates proportional representation with some kind of list. That's true. At least in a majority of them, the voters choose who gets elected from the list. That's essentially what happens here. So the rest of Europe and us may not be quite so different as appears. Secondly, primaries. That was the great solution introduced in America to break down parties, a populist movement against parties to have primaries so that people in smoke-filled rooms didn't pick the candidates. We effectively have primaries, but we we do it cheaply. We do it all on the same day. We don't have to have a primary election and another election. The choice of candidates within a party that the public makes on election day is effectively the primary and the election at the same time.
Can I just add that answers in part Deputy Dowd's question about internal party competition, that's one advantage of going the other way, but it's the internal party competition that gives the choice Michael Marsh talks about.
Okay. I just want to thank everybody for, I think it's been both a civilised and a stimulating discussion, and thank you both very much, in particular Noel and Brendan. Okay, just before we... just before we move into roundtable discussions, I just want to tell you briefly about an event that took place in the Mansion House on the 21st of April. It was a mini convention, a mini constitutional convention, organised by Youth Work Ireland. And 66 young people came together, and rather than taking a year, as we are doing, to discuss our 8 or 9 issues, they did it in a day. And it was Art and myself were there, it was the most stimulating and encouraging event. It just showed the interest of at least a certain number of young people in current affairs and in politics. And we have 3 of those people here today to observe how we're conducting the convention. And they are Robert O'Driscoll, Erin Bright, I'm sorry, I can't read my own writing. Erin Brightwood and Joanna Sierversky, and they're at the back, so would you mind standing up and just introduce? So it's tremendous to have you here today, and I felt that day was a day of a real hope, I think, for our future in seeing those young people together. So, great. So now, after the end of a morning, we get to the point where it's over to you. So we're going to move into roundtable discussion. Your facilitators are ready and available to start the discussion, and you have until 1 o'clock, slightly less than we had planned, but till 1 o'clock when we break for lunch. Thank you very much.